Welcome to Andy Staples on 3. The Associated Press poll is out, and it is wrong. Well, I mean, the preseason poll is always going to be wrong because 18 to 22-year-olds tend to be a fairly unpredictable lot. And when you're trying to predict how that many of them will finish in order, it's pretty much a fool's errand. So, yeah, it's going to be wrong. But we're still going to imagine what it's going to look like if they got it right, if they were predicting the college football playoff final ranking, because it's just fun to put the teams in a bracket. So we threw them in a bracket. Look at this. You got Penn State going to Tuscaloosa in round 1. You have Michigan going to Austin to play Texas. Now, this is a weird one. This is interesting because this is something that could happen. Remember, Texas plays at Michigan in week 2 this year. In the AP poll, Texas is ranked 6th. Michigan's ranked 11th. The way it would shake out, Texas is ranked 4th. Michigan is ranked 9th. They would wind up being the number 6 and the number 11 seeds in the playoff because of the way the playoff rules work. And so they'd end up playing each other, but in Austin this time. That'd be fun. You have a rematch of the Byron Hout-LeGarrette Blunt Bowl. In the 12-5 game, Boise State going to Eugene. Now, the original LeGarrette Blunt Byron Hout game took place on the Blue in Boise. It was Chip Kelly's first game as Oregon's head coach, and Boise State won it. But a little fascinating piece of history there, if that's how it wound up shaking out. And that's the most interesting thing about all this is, what does this mean in terms of the playoff? What does it mean at the end of the season? And my friend Ralph Russo of the Associated Press did some interesting research on this. So Ralph doesn't vote in the poll, but he compiles all the votes, and it kind of is the historian for the poll. He's the one who tries to contextualize it for us. And that's, with the AP poll, it is sort of a living document that basically week to week documents the history of college football. So here's what he came up with. Ralph went back to when the playoffs started, the 14 playoffs started in 2014, and looked at the preseason AP polls versus the final CFP ranking on each of those teams. And here's what he found. So on average, 9 of the teams that would have made the CFP in a 12-team format, using the same rules that this season will use, 9 teams that were ranked in the preseason top 25 would have made the playoff, which means 3 on average unranked teams in the preseason poll would make the playoff. So that's where we're scouring the also receiving votes section. Like, who are these teams? Who's it going to be? Last year, only 1 would have. It was Missouri. But there were years where I believe 2022, 5 would have. So keep an eye out for that. And it's a good reminder, especially after 9 months of just talking over the same talking points again and again and again and again and again, that the season will surprise you. And the season is definitely going to surprise us. So, according to Ralph's research, the preseason number 1 team would have made the CFP every season. 7 of those would have earned a bye, which is interesting because it also means that 3 of them wouldn't have. Number 2 in the preseason poll would have made the playoff 8 times. So 2 times they did not. Ralph broke this down in a very interesting way. He basically figured out, here's how, based on what we've seen for 10 years of data, if you want to try to make a more realistic projection of what it's going to look like at the end of this season, here's how you do it. 4 of the top 5 teams. So you take 4 of the teams in the current AP top 25. 4 of the top 5. So Georgia's 1, Ohio State's 2, Oregon's 3, Texas is 4, Alabama's 5. You got to throw one of those out and say, I think these 4 are going to make it. Which I think is kind of tough, because I look at those and I'm like, I don't know which one of those gets thrown out. I have no clue. I think all of those are going to make it. If you look at my post-spring top 25, I had all of them in. I had them all. I didn't have them all in that order, but that might be my top 5 if I recall correctly. If it's not, there's only one slight difference. So that's the part that makes this tough. Like, you got to pick one of those, and we spent all offseason saying all 5 of those are definitely in. So you got to pick one of those to throw out. 2 teams ranked between 6 and 10. So you can only take 2 of those 5. Well, in the AP poll, that's Ole Miss, Notre Dame, Penn State, Michigan, and Florida State. Well, I go back to my post-spring top 25. The only one of those I don't have in the playoff is Penn State, and they were 1 spot out. I have no idea who to throw out here either. And it's a good challenge to our groupthink, our collective groupthink. Collective groupthink is a little bit redundant, but I digress. But it's a good challenge to our groupthink in the offseason, where we just assume these teams are the good teams and these teams are the ones that aren't going to make it. So you got to pick 2 teams that are ranked between 6 and 10. 2 teams that are ranked between 11 and 20. Now, I go back to my post-spring top 25. I've got one of those teams in the playoff already in my version of it. I had Tennessee making it because I had them ranked in the top 10. I think I had them in number 10 in my post-spring top 25. So, but I don't know who the other one would be in this situation. So now one team ranked between 21 and 25, which also very interesting. Now, in this particular iteration, with the playoff working this way, if you look at that, you probably say, okay, here's where you can pick your Big 12 champ, or you could pick your Big 12 champ in the next one, because the Big 12 feels so even that it could be one of the 5 ranked Big 12 teams in the preseason poll, or it could be an unranked Big 12 team. So we're going to do this exercise in a second, but there's one more category that Ralph gave us. You have to pick 3 unranked teams. Now, there are no group of 5 teams ranked in the AP top 25 preseason poll. So that's one of them. One of them will be the group of 5 representative, whoever that is. The highest also receiving votes from the group of 5 in the AP poll right now is Boise State. So for them, they have Boise State in there. Let's try this. Let's try this little exercise. We will start with 4 of the top 5. So we're going to take one team out of the top 5. I'm taking out Texas. I don't really have a reason for that. I like all 5 of these. I think all 5 of these teams are going to make the playoff. But the exercise says you got to take one out. So I'm going to take Texas out and say, if we had to come up with a reason, we'll say they lost more than we realized. They had to replace a lot of skill position guys in the transfer portal. Maybe they had injury issues. Remember, CJ Baxter's already out with a preseason injury. So let's just take that. We'll take them out, and we'll say Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Alabama made it. And I guess we'll have to put them in that order. I got producer River trying to make a graphic on the fly here. So River, let's say those teams are going to be in that order, but we'll just bump Alabama up to number 4, which means that Oregon will be number 5, the number 5 seed. Alabama will be your number 6 seed in the playoffs. So we'll have Georgia and Ohio State getting byes as the SEC champ and Big Ten champ, number 1 and number 2. So we still have to figure out an ACC champ and a Big 12 champ. Those 2 will be the 3 and the 4 seeds, depending on the order we decide they're in. Next, 2 teams between 6 and 10. Ole Miss, Notre Dame, Penn State, Michigan, Florida State. I actually feel like I can come up with some legitimate reasons why the 3 I can pull out of here didn't make it. But I'm going to tell you right now, I'm picking Florida State in here, one, because I think Florida State's going to be really good, And I do think Florida State's going to win the ACC, but I got to have an ACC champ in this thing somewhere. So that's one of the reasons why I'm picking Florida State. I'm also going to pick Ole Miss. And I'll tell you why on that one too. SEC Media Days, Nick Saban, in his first major role as an ESPN commentator, one of the first things he said was he believes Ole Miss has bolstered itself on the line of scrimmage enough this offseason to be competitive with the top teams in the SEC. And that was kind of my big question. Did they get to that level? I trust his opinion more than I trust most people's opinion on that. So I'm gonna take Ole Miss. Notre Dame, we talked about. I think they would have to go 11-1 against this particular schedule to get an at-large. Maybe they don't. Maybe they lose to Texas A&M. Maybe they lose to Florida State. If I've got Florida State in here, they don't have to have beaten Notre Dame to get in. They just need to win the ACC. But we can say they did. Penn State, we can say the offense didn't turn around as much as they think. Michigan, we can say, well, they lost so much from that national title team and just came up short. Willie T, he says, bolstered? What does that word mean? It means improved. It means improved, Willie. It means improved, Coach Prime, who still has not answered the question about the offensive line. Loves his D-line, not answered questions about the O-line. All right. So we have now 6 playoff teams. We've now filled half the bracket. River, that means we've got Ole Miss as the number 6 team and they would be the number 8 seed. No, they'd be the number 7 seed. Sorry, we'd have them just at 5 because we took one out of the top 5. So we'll have Ole Miss as the number 7 seed. We'll have Florida State as the number 3 seed because they're the ACC champ. So we filled through 7, except we've got a hole at 4, which will be the Big 12 champ. And then we've got to figure out who else gets in. So 1 from 11 through 16. I can take the easy way out and say number 12 Utah is your Big 12 champ. But that might not actually be the easy way out because I still got to get 3 unranked teams in this list. So who's that going to be? I'm going to save my Big 12 champ spot for an unranked team. I'm going to save them. And who knows? Maybe I'll throw an at-large team in from one of these. So I get 2 from 11 through 20. Let's see if I can pull this off. So 11 through 20 is Missouri, Utah, LSU, Clemson, Tennessee, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Miami, and Texas A&M. Now, I would probably in real life pick my Big 12 champ from this list. Between Utah, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, they got Arizona down at 21. So I'd probably be picking my Big 12 champ from this list, but I've got to pick 2 from this group. I'm going to pick Tennessee because I had them in my post-spring top 25 actually making the playoff. 1 more. So do I pick the Big 12 champ or do I pick another at-large? Do I pick Miami as an at-large here? Do I dare? Chicken 1515 says Boomer Sooner. Let's do that one. Because if Oklahoma goes 10-2 against their schedule, they're making the playoff. Let's pick Oklahoma and Tennessee here, who, by the way, play each other. All right. So that would make Tennessee the 8 seed, Oklahoma the 9 seed in the playoff. I'm not even worried about where they're ranked in the playoff rankings anymore because I'm just going to get confused. River is texting me the running tab to make sure we got this right. So I'm picking Tennessee and Oklahoma as my teams from 11 through 20. Now I get 1 from 21 through 25. So that's Arizona, Kansas, USC, NC State, and Iowa. If I'm doing it this way, then I'm going to do NC State as an at-large coming out of the ACC, a second at-large, but I don't think I'm going to do that. I've said I think Iowa could be a sneaky potential at-large team because of its schedule. Now, again, we don't know what their quarterback situation is going to be, but that one lends itself to the kind of record you're going to need to get in. The defense is still going to be really good. So I'm going to put Iowa in that next spot. So that makes Iowa the 10 seed. Iowa is your 10 seed. So I've got 3 more spots to fill. This is going to be very, very tricky. I've got to pick a Big 12 champ. And I said I was going to use an unranked Big 12 team as your Big 12 champ. So I'm going to go with UCF as the Big 12 champ. And then I've got to pick a Group of 5 team. I don't know who in the world to pick for the Group of 5 team. I am going to go with Appalachian State. Let's say Appalachian State wins the Sun Belt. Maybe they even beat Clemson. Because remember, I didn't pick Clemson as one of my playoff teams. The AP has them ranked pretty high. Let's say they took a tumble. So I'm going to pick Appalachian State. So your 12 seed is going to be Appalachian State. Your 4 seed is going to be UCF. Now I got to put one more team into the playoff. Oh boy. Who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? Because I would love to have Penn State or Michigan, but that's against the rules of this exercise. So do I pick another Big Ten team? Because right now, I've got 3 Big Ten teams in there. I've got Ohio State, Oregon, and I've got Iowa. So is there another Big Ten team that could make it? Or does a second Big 12 team make it? Does a second ACC team make it? The 2 ACC teams that I could see being at-large teams, Miami and NC State, they're in the preseason poll. I can't pick them based on this exercise. You know what? Remember we had Ari Timken on the show? And he said, watch out for this team. I'm going to say, watch out for this team. I'm going to say West Virginia makes it as an at-large, gets that final at-large spot. Because if I don't have Penn State making it, maybe West Virginia beat them week 1. Maybe that's the non-conference win that's anchoring that schedule. And maybe West Virginia and UCF played a classic Big 12 championship game. And they were both very good teams in the Big 12. Maybe they were one-loss teams going to the Big 12 championship game. And UCF won and West Virginia lost. I mean, can you even imagine? Can you even imagine? Super Producer River is now putting this graphic together of what this thing would look like. I can't wait to see it because I'm trying to go over in my head what the matchups are. Oh, we got it. We got it. Okay, here we go. Very interesting. Remember how if the AP poll is correct, we'll get the rematch at a different stadium of Michigan and Texas. Same thing here. So in this one, you have Oklahoma going to Neyland Stadium. Remember, Tennessee goes to Norman in September. I believe that game is September 28th. Appalachian State going to Eugene to play Oregon. West Virginia, Alabama, and Tuscaloosa. The bars in Tuscaloosa will be dry. Iowa at Ole Miss would be a heck of a lot of fun as well. Your potential Alabama or West Virginia, Florida State semi. Your potential Ole Miss or Iowa at Ohio State semi. Tennessee or Oklahoma playing against Georgia. And again, like we talk about the 5 seed being advantageous, like the 5 seed going to play UCF. Now, where would let's figure out where the quarterfinals would be. remember, the old bowl associations do matter still for the next 2 years. So Georgia has to go to the Sugar Bowl. Ohio State has to go to the Rose Bowl. Florida State would be going to the Orange Bowl, but the Orange Bowl is a semi. So Florida State would be in the Peach Bowl. That UCF Oregon game would be in the Fiesta Bowl. That would be very, very interesting. But that may look weird. So that 12 might look really weird, but based on history, we're going to get something like that. There's going to be surprises. And I'm glad because, again, this is a good reminder because we spend 9-10 months talking about all this stuff, about what it's going to look like. And then the first week just blows it all up. So bring on the blowing it all up. Bring it on. I'm ready for it. I'm ready for the weirdness of whatever that playoff is. Cannot wait. Next up, we're going to talk about one of those teams that expects to make this playoff that we had in those brackets. Tim Watts from Bama Online joins us to talk Alabama as Kalen DeBoer takes over. We welcome the great Tim Watts of Bama Online, and lots of questions for Tim as Alabama goes through the first training camp under Kalen DeBoer, because Tim, 2007 was a long time ago. I guess 2006 would have been the last time a non-Nick Saban coach held a preseason camp, and that would have been the great Mike Shula. This is so different.
Yeah, it takes a minute to get used to it. I mean, you knew it would be different. I mean, you had a coach that had been doing it forever, completely old school guy, doing all those little things you expect a guy from that era to do. And then you come in with a coach that's 20-something years younger, 20 years younger, a younger mentality. You know, the kids are actually younger, social media, they're smarter, they're making money. So you knew it would be different. And it is. It's completely different than what you saw with Nick Saban from the, practice music. I mean, that was one thing, to the accessibility to people, the coaches. We're not used to seeing assistant coaches. I mean, we went a decade without hearing from anyone but Kirby Smart and the offensive coordinator, it's felt like. So now you got everyone talking, you get to see them all and you get to see their personalities. And to be honest, I think it's a good thing. I think these guys sell their program. I think it's a recruiting tool. Jamarcus Shepard's been fantastic. Mo Linquist, all those guys, getting to see their personality, I think helps the Alabama fans know what they're dealing with.
So I think my biggest question is with the offense, and obviously this is a different situation than Kalen DeBoer even had at Washington last year, because he's got a different coordinator. Nick Sheridan's the coordinator now. He was the tight ends coach at Washington last year, but different quarterback in Jalen Milroe, a different skill set than Michael Penix, obviously. But coming into the year that Jalen Milroe is the guy. And I was thinking about this the other day, Tim. Last year, a quarter of the season went by before Alabama said, Jalen Milroe's our guy. And I would say that it was even longer before Tommy Rees, who was the OC at the time, decided, I'm going to call plays that suit Jalen Milroe's skill sets. You're talking about like a third of the season going by before that happened. Is this going to look like a little bit more built for Jalen Milroe offense off the bat?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's your quarterback one. I haven't heard anything else about that. I mean, you bring up a great point. It's like the Tyler Buckner start at South Florida didn't happen. Nobody talks about it. I mean, nobody discussed it. I mean, Jalen Milroe didn't even play in that game. So to work from there to where he is now, I think this coaching staff has confidence in Milroe. A lot of the reports we get back are he is confident, he's relaxed, he's learning. And hey, you watch the offense that these guys run. I mean, anybody that watches the breakdown of Kalen DeBoer and what they do, there's a lot of options, long, deep, short, check downs, all that stuff to help him have a chance to be successful. And also, he's got another year under his belt. I mean, Jalen Milroe is battle tested at this stage, having played in the biggest stages. I mean, he played Georgia on a neutral field. He played at Auburn. He played Michigan in the national championship game. So there's some confidence that goes from being in those games and getting that experience.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see. And we talked to Joe Cook from Inside Texas the other day. We were talking about Isaiah Bond and Amari Niblack in their new spots. Who steps in as the guys that Jalen Milroe is going to be throwing to?
I like Jeremy Bernard. I don't think he got enough attention. I mean, he played behind three guys, one first, second, and third round picks at Washington. Stood out in the spring game. Obviously, he's the first guy I think you look at, along with some of the experienced guys like Kobe Prentice. And you absolutely have to talk about Ryan Williams, right? I mean, this is a guy that's still supposed to be playing high school football. They had a practice play escape the field the other day, one great one-handed catch, and we know everything that guy's built. Some guys are just built different, whether they're 16 or 26. Some of them are just built different. I think Ryan's one of those. It's going to be hard to keep him off the field. And as good as I think the wide receiver core can be with Jalen, I also think a big benefit for Kalen DeBoer, Nick Sheridan in Alabama that they didn't necessarily have at Washington is the running game. I mean, you got Jamarian Miller over here hearing great things about him. You got Justice Haynes, you got Richard, and you got a lot of guys talented in that backfield, and you have a superior interior offensive line when you add Parker Brailsford coming back with Booker and and He-Man out there. You got a all SEC type middle offensive line to work behind.
Yeah, and then the Caden Proctor thing, I think the most interesting part of the Caden Proctor story, and it got kind of overshadowed by him going to Iowa and coming back, was how much he improved last season over the course of the year. I mean, you look at that SEC championship game, he was awesome in that game. You look at the Arkansas game in the middle of the season, you're like, oh man, this guy's a freshman. But the Caden Proctor we're going to see this year, I'm guessing he's going to be very similar to that guy we saw in the SEC championship game.
I think he'll get there eventually. I'm curious. This guy hasn't played since last year, the season. So he missed spring. He didn't go through spring. So he's still going through some growing pains, I would expect. Playing with a different body. He's lighter than he was before. But like you said, talent is talent. There's still 3 weeks to the season. He's getting those reps. And don't forget, he's getting reps against a really good defensive line. They're not like a bunch of big name guys like you've seen at Georgia, but the minute Kane Womack got to Alabama and Kalen DeBoer, one of the first groups they were talking about, perhaps one they've talked about the most, is the defensive line. So the offensive linemen are getting tested. The left tackle, the right tackle, all of them are getting that work they need to get.
Well, and that D-line is not something we've talked about a lot. We've talked about what's happened and what's changed in the secondary with Caleb Downs leaving, obviously Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry getting drafted. But I thought when I was there in the spring that the D-line looked very deep, especially up the middle. Like we talked about Tim Keenan, Jaheim Otis, Tim Smith, and Jaheim Otis wasn't even practicing at the time, but you knew he was coming back. They've got a bunch of guys who played. It feels like that's a group that they can feel pretty confident in.
There's a lot of experience. There's a lot of growth. These guys are moving on up in their age. I mean, they've got, again, Overton's a guy we don't even really talk about that much yet, but heard he had a great spring game this weekend. So there's guys that have depth. You got guys with experience. You got talented guys like James Smith who's sitting back there waiting for his turn. So the one thing about that group I think that you have to like is they're pushing each other because there's not a guaranteed lock. There's, like you said, when you get depth, that goes to that whole iron sharpens iron situation. And I think Alabama's got that. Now, again, it's not a bunch of guys that are mentioned in the top 10 picks in the draft, but I think everybody's pretty excited about that group as a whole. And I think they've got a chance to be a difference maker.
Now, let's talk about the secondary because it is going to look very different. This is a case where they needed to go out and get Keon Sabb from Michigan. They got Damani Jackson from USC, and they lost some really good players. But I also remember when I was visiting in the spring, seeing Kane Womack, and he's talking about the freshmen they brought in. I wouldn't be shocked if we see some freshman corners playing too.
No, I think that's going to be on the table. I mean, you lose 3 first-round draft picks. I think you project Caleb Downs there in the future. Terrion Arnold, unbelievable football player. Kool-Aid had been a staple for a couple of years. So you're using a lot of experience and talent, but you're bringing in a very talented group of guys. We hear a lot about Xavier Brown's not your normal freshman. He makes a lot of plays. Heard him matched up with Ryan Williams several times this year. You also bring in Zay Mincy, who might have the biggest upside of all the cornerbacks when all said and done. He probably had a little bit longer learning curve than Xavier did, but I think he's just as talented. So you bring those guys in because, yeah, the safeties I think you feel okay with. I mean, you got Malachi came back. You got Keon Saad. He's a good football player. But, out on the corners, you got right now Damani Jackson. And, the big thing for Damani for me is this is a money year for him. It's almost like that free agent year. I mean, this is a chance. didn't probably get as much out of his first 2 years as he wanted, but now he's getting that chance. He's going to be that chance to be that boundary corner and, have an impact.
Yeah, and that's the thing. They look like maybe they're not as uber talented back there as they were last year, because you lose Caleb Downs. That is a big loss. But I'm not that worried about their defense. I don't see the issues there.
Well, you know what makes a secondary go from good to great is a good pass rush. So
Yes.
if you get those guys off the edge, they look a whole lot better. If you get guys coming off that edge, collapsing that pocket in the middle, which is going to be the plan. I mean, we know that Kane Wommack is going to be extremely aggressive. That defense, he's got linebackers with a lot of experience. He's got edge guys, a ton of talent to try to put pressure on there. That'll certainly help a young secondary because, defending for 3 seconds is a heck of a lot better than trying to run with the guy for 5 seconds.
Exactly. All right. So I'm going to ask you the same thing I've asked all the other folks we've talked to. And because I think this is a fun thought starter preseason. So I'm looking at Alabama's schedule right now. When you look at this schedule, what's the game where your Bama Online subscribers are like, this is definitely a win, we got this, that you look at it and go, wait a second, this is not a gimme here?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm always kind of the eternal pessimist when it comes to things. One game I'm kind of looking at is the Missouri game. I'm glad. I think it's good that game's at home because you sandwich in, going to Tennessee, Missouri's at home, and then you go to LSU. There's a lot that can happen there. Missouri's going to have some talented guys. They're a scrappy bunch. I don't think Missouri's being talked enough about overall. I still think Alabama's obviously in a good position to win that game, but it's a game I think you have to circle and watch. And also Oklahoma is one I personally watch. Now the fans, they seem to be worried the most about Wisconsin. Maybe that's the great unknown. I don't know as much about Wisconsin as I do the other teams, but very interesting schedule because there's a lot of teams you don't really associate with the Bama schedule. You go down this, I mean, South Florida's coming back. There's another game that you didn't really think a whole lot about, but you got Oklahoma. You're not used to seeing them. Georgia's a regular season game. So it's quite the schedule. I think it's a great schedule for Alabama, especially from a recruiting standpoint where they're going to have a lot of big games at home to have visitors there.
Yeah. And this is a hard schedule. It's because we talk about Florida and we talk about Oklahoma as getting the kind of really rough schedules in the SEC. Mississippi State did too. But I don't think of the playoff contenders, Alabama's is up there. Now, Georgia's got the 3 really hard games on the road, but Alabama, at Oklahoma, Missouri at home, they're kind of, I think they're lucky they got South Carolina at home. You don't want to go to South Carolina as Alabama because that's one they circle. It's their, highlight of their season situation. This is a rough schedule.
Yeah, I think it's a 2-loss schedule. You're still in the playoffs when all's said and done. I mean, I think if you skate through here, I mean, there's some good teams on there. Now, a lot of this will change. There'll be teams we think that are good that aren't very good. But I think the teams we're looking like, I don't know a whole lot about Oklahoma. I don't know what to expect with them. I know what Georgia is. I know what Tennessee is, LSU, those schools. But there's some uncertainty with this schedule. This could be the toughest schedule in the nations when all's said and done. Or it could look a little less depending on how teams like Oklahoma do. It's a big year for them. Wisconsin, teams like that could change how we perceive this overall.
I do feel like they get the kind of it warms up nicely heading into Georgia because you got Western Kentucky's TJ Finley, old friend TJ Finley, who played at LSU and Auburn and then Texas State. And then there's USF who challenged them last year, and Byron Brown's one of the better quarterbacks in the group of 5. And then, a trip to Wisconsin where you don't really know what the Badgers are going to be in year 2 under Luke Fickell.
Yeah, I think the one thing, you don't know what a lot of the schedule is, but a lot of people don't know what this Alabama team is yet. I mean, this is a skill set, very good team. Obviously went to the college football playoffs. They're competitive every year. And now you've got kind of a creator calling the plays. It's going to be a little bit more aggressive, a lot more emotion. Again, an experienced Jalen Milroe, a very good middle of the offensive line. There's still questions on this team, but I think you're most excited if you're an Alabama's fan to see what Kalen DeBoer can do with this kind of talent. And you're most curious to see what happens on defense. I mean, there's a lot of people trying to figure out the swarm and how that's going to work and the aggression, but I do think they're going to like it because, the one thing that bothered, I think, as great as Bama defenses were, the biggest complaint always heard was them sitting back on 3rd and 14, 3rd and 13, and giving up big plays. That always bothered the fans the most. I don't think we're going to see that as much as we did in the past.
Well, that always is a double-edged sword because it can swing back the other. Why are they blitzing on 3rd and 14? How come they just don't take it easy and keep it all in front of them?
Yeah, that's the best play called after the play is over. That's when to tell us what we should have done. Should have did this.
But you know what we all learned, Tim? This is a lesson I think every single person who watches college football learned last year. When you're defending 4th and goal from the 31, rush more than 2.
Yeah, that's still, I don't think I've ever seen that play or the kick 6 where I understood how it happened. I don't understand how either happened. That's why I love sports, though. I don't know how it could have possibly, it never should have happened. And it happened. And in that scenario with those two teams is just the Bama Auburn absurdity in some of these plays is what makes it legendary.
So let me explain how I watched 4th and goal from the 31 last year, Tim. So I covered Michigan, Ohio State last year. And I get done, film what I need to film, write my story. So that, because that was a noon Eastern game. And obviously the Iron Bowl was a 2:30 Central game. And so I'm in the PF Chang's in Ann Arbor because the traffic is so bad that you cannot get back to the interstate. So I'm like, well, I got to go find somewhere to sit so I can watch the end of the second window games. And they had the Apple Cup on the TV, the one TV in the PF Chang's, because that's the only place you could get into. So I have the Iron Bowl on my iPad, and it's me and these 2 Michigan fans that are sitting next to me at the bar watching the Iron Bowl on my iPad. Nobody else in the room is seeing any of this. And we just jump out of our seats on the 4th and goal from the 31. We're like, he caught that? And the rest of PF Chang's turns and stares at us.
I had people texting me that I hadn't talked to in years. They weren't even in my phone. It was unbelievable. It was like I threw it or caught it. They were just like asking me questions. I had no idea how to answer it. I mean, the way it happened and to me, it was the ease of it. To me, it was him sitting back there watching the route, getting open in the end zone, shedding, catching, touchdown. That was this wasn't some Hail Mary tip pass and a bunch of mistakes. It was actually a 4th and 31 play. But again, your point's valid. You don't want to leave a quarterback sitting back there forever throwing darts, which is what Jalen did. One of the best passes of his life.
Unbelievable. All right, let's talk about this season, this schedule. We talked about the sneaky one. I want to talk to you about something I talked to Jake Rowe about on yesterday's show, because we were talking about Georgia's schedule and the 3 monster road games where they go to Bama, they go to Texas, they go to Ole Miss. And he said for the Georgia people in the building and the fan base, it's still the Alabama game. It's going to Tuscaloosa. Alabama is their boogeyman, because as good as they've been, they still have not been able to beat Alabama consistently. That's, they beat them in that national championship game, but they lose to them in the SEC championship game last year. Like, that's still the game for them. I'm curious from your perspective, is Alabama still the game for most of the teams on its schedule, or has Georgia or Texas taken that spot?
I mean, Georgia and Texas get and deserve a lot of respect. I mean, top 5 programs, big name coaches, a lot of talent, everything they've got going on. But I don't know of anybody. I judge this. I know this. Teams that don't even play Alabama celebrate Alabama's almost losses. So when Bama almost lost, they're all over social media celebrating they almost lost. So I still think Alabama's the biggest game for most people. Now, I think it could depend. I mean, for Oklahoma, it might be Texas or something along those lines. But I don't think you want to necessarily – I don't think you're just saying, hey, babe, they're playing Alabama this week. I don't think we'll go by any means. I mean, Georgia gets and deserves all the respect they should. Texas is the same way. But when Alabama, again, no matter what happens in the Alabama game, everybody has an opinion. And I mean, from the left coast to the right coast, north to south, they all have an opinion. You can see it on social media, on any of the On3 message boards. It's people talking about how lucky Bama was or how Bama gets away with penalties. So Bama's still a big deal.
I don't know if you heard, but Bama never gets called for holding.
They never. It's amazing. I mean, the year Tennessee beat them, I was talking with friends of mine, and they had 20, whatever, 19, 20 penalties, and they acted like, well, they didn't get the good penalty. So I've never understood. I mean, I do know Alabama fans would disagree. All they talk about is all the penalties.
So going back to Neyland for the first time since that game, I think that's going to be a fun one too. And this again kind of underscores how difficult this schedule is, because that Missouri game is right up against that Tennessee game. You know, you got the Georgia game before that, a few weeks before that. It's not going to be easy, but especially going back to Neyland, where that place was electric, and this should be a much better Tennessee team than the one that came to Tuscaloosa last year.
Yeah, it should be. I don't know if they can be a better, more talent, a smarter offense. The team that beat Alabama literally found the 2 or 3 plays that worked and just ran them into the ground. It was offense was, Bama couldn't stop them. I mean, Tennessee did all the right things, pressed all the right buttons, had the breaks they needed fall their way in that game. Still one of the craziest games I've ever seen, from all the way through the ending to the wild fumbles, the turnovers, the penalties and stuff. I think Tennessee's always going to be a tough place to play. They're going to have Nico, an exciting quarterback. He's going to bring a different dimension than the other quarterbacks we've seen in the past. But there's an uncertainty there. How good is their defense going to be? We know what Josh Heupel's going to do on offense. We know how good Nico has the potential to be, and they've been waiting to see it. But that crowd, I don't think you can sleep on that crowd. I say that for several SEC games: LSU, Alabama, Auburn. All those teams are great and tough to play on the road.
The funniest part about this, the craziest part about this, you just brought up LSU for the first time. Yeah. Like, Alabama plays in Baton Rouge this year. Mm-hmm. You just brought up LSU because that's where they're at, with the Georgia coming, with them having to go to Tennessee, with Missouri being good again. That Alabama LSU game could be just as important as any of these other ones.
Well, you put that 3. That's a lot of these
in there.
Yeah, a lot of these games, when I was looking through the SEC schedule, a lot of them have these 2 or 3 games in a row. Auburn has a tough 3-game stretch on the road. Mm-hmm. Alabama, if you look at that, I mean, there's at Tennessee, very emotional game. Come back, Missouri at home, who is going to be a competitive football team. And then you go back to LSU. Now, you got a lot of young guys Alabama's did very well in Baton Rouge, but you got a lot of young guys who will be excited. It might not mean as much, but I tell you the one thing, when you're going to Oklahoma, when you're going to Norman, Baton Rouge, and LSU, the one thing you really want is an experienced quarterback. And again, that goes back to Jalen having a lot of experience. I mean, hey, playing Georgia in the SEC championship game in Atlanta, that's a road game. That's a loud crowd, heavily Georgia favored. Just did a great job there, was very poised in that game, and, big part of them finishing it off. So he's got that experience, but you definitely don't want to be flying in there with a freshman quarterback or a guy that hadn't been in that situation. So that's one benefit to Alabama. Plus, again, the experienced offensive lineman in the middle.
Look at that. Tim is a pro, bringing it full circle. That's where we started. Jalen Milroe taking snaps from Parker Brailsford.
Yeah.
Offense built around him. Look different than anything we've seen. Cannot wait. Tim, thank you so much.
Hey, man, anything for you. I appreciate you and love watching the shows. You do a great job, Andy.
That is Tim Watts from Bama Online. By the way, if you'd like to subscribe to Bama Online, if you're a Bama fan, want to cruise the message boards, want to post, use the code Andy1 for $1 for your first month as a new subscriber. It doesn't just have to be Bama Online. It could be VolQuest if you're a Tennessee fan. Could be War Chant if you're a Florida State fan, Letterman Row if you love Ohio State, the Wolverine if you love Michigan, the Wolfpacker if you love NC State, Inside Texas for Texas, Sooner Scoop for Oklahoma, you name it, we got it here at On3. So come join the family. $1 for your first month. Use that code Andy1 at checkout. Another guy you'd want to talk to is Sean Callahan, Husker Online. We are going to talk Nebraska with him, but I want to get into this mock playoff bracket we made using Ralph Russo's research. So super producer River and I have been going back and forth about, like, how did this happen? Because, we had West Virginia as our last at large. Like, so what happened in the schedule that made that happen? And here's how we figured it out. We figured one of the reasons Penn State didn't make it is they lost to West Virginia in week 1. So that and that win for West Virginia would be the kind of thing that would really help you make your case. We had West Virginia beating UCF, which remember we have UCF as the Big 12 champ. So we have West Virginia beating UCF when they meet in Morgantown late in the season, and then UCF gets revenge in the Big 12 championship game. And I think we had UCF losing to Florida, but then losing to Florida and West Virginia, and then beating West Virginia for the Big 12 championship. West Virginia, meanwhile, would have the wins against Penn State and Big 12 champ UCF, which would look great, but they'd also have another loss on the schedule. I would say at Stillwater, at Oklahoma State, October 5th, or possibly at Arizona in Tucson on October 26th. So you can plot the course. You can make a path for this. And like I said, this makes me more excited because this research goes back 10 years. Like, we are going to see unranked teams make this playoff. It could be 1, it could be 3, it could be 5. But we're going to be surprised. And that's the fun part. One team that may have a say in that, or who knows, maybe they're actually vying for a playoff berth late in the season. But, I had Iowa in the at-larges here. I had Iowa getting one of the at-large spots. A way Iowa could not get an at-large spot is if they lost to Nebraska on Black Friday. Nebraska may have a say in this. Or, who knows? Like I said, maybe Nebraska is competing for this. We shall see. I've said all offseason, baby steps, just get bowl eligible. We'll worry about the other stuff later. But they're pretty excited in Lincoln. Let's talk to Sean Callahan from Husker Online. How about Sean Callahan of Husker Online? And Dylan Raiola watch continues because everybody's very excited about the freshman QB at Nebraska. But Sean, I'm going to start on the more established side of the ball on defense. How has Nebraska's defense looked through the first few weeks of practice?
Well, I think it's a pretty good unit. The one question was linebackers. They lost 2 veterans in Nick Henrich and Luke Reimer, and I feel like they've actually got a chance to be just as good or better with what they have in there. But their defensive line is strong. It's deep. They have all the veterans back, and then they have very good young talent. But Nash Hutmacher, Ty Robinson, Jamari Butler, are all veteran 5th, 6th-year type players in this program. And then on the back end of the defense in the 3-3-5 in that secondary, they have a really good group of 7 or 8 defensive backs that can play those 5 positions. So I think it's a unit, and it just depends on how some of these games go, but they can be easily a top 15 level national defense statistically, especially with Tony White back. And I think John Butler coming in from the Buffalo Bills, as tough as that timing was, lose Evan Cooper, he's been a great addition, being the secondary coach for the number 1 ranked defense in the NFL a year ago. Well,
and the Butler addition is a really interesting one because obviously the Cooper firing happened at a very inopportune time. But Butler's in a strange situation. He left the Bills because he got passed over for the DC job. He wants to be a play calling defensive coordinator and basically dropped down a level because I would assume the idea is if he does well here and Tony White gets a head coaching job, he's probably calling plays for Nebraska, and then he can prove himself as a play caller.
Yeah, there's no question. I think that path was laid out, or anybody knows that. There's really not a internal candidate on Matt Rule's staff before John Butler got here that's a slam dunk to replace Tony White. Evan Cooper was always a name that you heard mentioned possibly as he grew as a coach. But Tony White, when you look at it now, he was very close to becoming UCLA's head coach. After watching Big Ten Media Days, I think he would have been just fine on that podium and would have given a little bit better of an opening address than Foster. But, he was a candidate for the San Diego State head job. He was a candidate, obviously, for UCLA. Lincoln Riley knocked on his door to be his defensive coordinator at USC. And if he puts together another good year in Lincoln, there's no doubt his name is going to fall again on some of these head coaching lists.
So let's transition to the offense because the defense feels like it is in very good hands. Reading through what you guys wrote off the scrimmage on Saturday, it seems like the O-line is definitely not as deep as they'd hoped it would be. What has been going on there?
Well, they came into camp with 7 linemen that have started Power 5 or Power 4 or Nebraska games. So that's a good number. I mean,
Yeah.
you'd be hard pressed to find any programs that have more.
Oh, you'll take it.
And after that, they lost one of those guys, Teddy Prohaska. He got out for the year, so down to 6. Then one of their lower guys of that group, Henry Latoski, got hurt. He's out 2 or 3 weeks. They're down to 5. Turner Corcoran, who missed last year for part of last season with an injury, he's back, but they're kind of limiting his work. So they're playing with 4 of those best 7 right now. And then I would say there's a fairly big drop off when you start to get to that next group because they're younger players that have not played Big Ten football, particularly at the tackle position. Gunnar Gatula and Grant Seagren, 2 redshirt freshmen, have been getting live reps with left tackle, and they're going against a veteran defensive line of players in practice. So I do think that is the concern. But if Turner Corcoran gets back, he started over 30 games in his career as a left tackle. They'll be fine. The right tackle, Bryce Benhart, has started over 40 games in his career. They brought in Micah Mazuka, a 30-some game starter, and he's going to be a guard. Ben Scott is a 30, 40 game starter at center. They have a very good group. And then Justin Jenkins will be the other guard, and he played a lot and started some games last year. Then Latoski will be back. So as long as Corcoran can just give them a serviceable presence, I'm not saying they need this guy to be all world. They're going to be fine. But that he's a big part of this discussion because I do think it's a significant drop off if Turner Corcoran is at all limited this year.
Well, and so we went over the show yesterday. We were going over Deion Sanders' press conference, which is, a lot of it was just weird. But if you read between the lines of that, you could tell he loves the defensive line, especially the edge rushers they have. And so when I was reading through your practice reports, I was like, ooh, that could be a pretty interesting matchup because like BJ Green, Dayon Hayes, Samuel Okunlola, very good group at Colorado if they can pick on somebody inexperienced at Nebraska. But like you said, if Turner's back, then that's probably not that big of a deal. But that's a matchup to watch because my read on that press conference was this is a guy who loves his D-line and does not seem particularly confident in his O-line. We just talked about Nebraska's D-line. Like that could be a game where both quarterbacks are running around quite a bit.
Well, and they have other their tight ends are really good at Nebraska. So, they can be creative and use those tight ends because they have 3 really good blocking tight ends, and they have 3 running backs that have played a lot of football that are very good in pass protection. So I'm sure you can scheme it up if there's an issue there, and Colorado is going to load up a left side or a right side and go after your tackle play. Nebraska's going to figure it out. And Dylan Raiola, one thing he's good at doing, I've heard, is checking out a place, throwing it away. He's not going to force much. For a freshman, it's rare to have the maturity and the poise that he's already shown thus far in his career and practices.
Well, and after the Jeff Sims experience to open the season last year, I'm sure Nebraska fans are just, they don't want to think about a quarterback throwing it willy-nilly. Like they need to know somebody's going to put it in the dirt if there's nobody open.
Yeah, just throwing it up to Tyler Nubbin, who was Minnesota's best player in the opener. I mean, Nebraska, you think about some of the games they lost. I mean, they had complete control. They forced PJ Fleck to throw it 35 times in the second half. That's the most by far he's ever done in his career because they could not run the ball. That's how well Nebraska's defense was playing in Minneapolis against a very run-first offense that PJ Fleck operates with, but they still figured out a way to blow it with interceptions and a late fumble by Anthony Grant. And that the season kind of turned. I mean, even at Colorado, they had control of that game in the midway part of the second quarter. And then the turnovers came
the wheels just fell off at the end of the second quarter, and it looked like a completely different game after that.
Yeah, the defense was playing physical. They sacked Shedeur Sanders 8 or 9 times. I mean, they had the right recipe going in there, making Colorado play a Big Ten style of a football game. But when you turn it over 2 or 3 times quickly, like Nebraska did, Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter and those guys, they were just too good. You can't give them that many free opportunities.
So who gets the bulk of the carries for Nebraska this year?
It's going to be a mix. I mean, I think Emmett Johnson and Ramir Johnson, it could be like 55-45 with Gabe Ervin Jr. could still come in there as a pounder. They need Gabe Ervin Jr. to prove he's healthy and durable. He's had multiple injuries. He is a true kind of bell cow, 230-pound 225-pound type back. Ramir Johnson's a 6-year senior that's played a lot of football. And then Emmett Johnson kind of assumed the job last year when both those guys got hurt. So I think it's going to be a combination of those three where there might be 40-some carries on a good game where those guys will split those carries.
Well, and that's my question, because you mentioned that Dylan Raiola seems to be pretty judicious with the ball. How much will the play calling affect that even more? Do you think they're going to try to run it as much as they can, get him comfortable, get in a situation where he's throwing, into a situation where there's a heavier box and more one-on-one matchups? Or are there going to be times where they have to just kind of let it rip?
A little bit of everything. I mean, they'll still run RPO, I think, but he'll just get rid of the ball and throw it, or do the handoff. But I don't think you'll see him just take off and run it a ton, because they don't want him doing that. I mean, he can do it, but it's just not smart when you look at him and what he's able to do as a thrower. His ability to see the field, though, and throw over the top of coverage. I mean, I've heard stories from the defensive coaches where, like, they're in the exact right call, and he's been able to throw the ball still over the top and make a perfect throw. So he's got arm talent we've probably not seen at Nebraska in a long, long time. It's a matter of, can they protect him? And, I think the schedule helps too. UTEP being in the opener. Colorado, we know it's going to be electric, but Northern Iowa, they've got a really good runway to kind of build this thing up, with Colorado coming into maybe one of the toughest atmospheres Memorial Stadium is going to present in a long time.
So the limited sample size we saw of Dylan Raiola in the spring game, the thing that I was intrigued by most, I think, are the different arm slots that he seems very natural throwing from. And I realize that that's something that young quarterbacks are just doing more and more now, but it seemed pretty natural for him. And how did he develop that? Because, like, we know with Patrick Mahomes, that's the guy who everybody's trying to emulate. He learned it playing baseball, and that's where it came from. But for Dylan Raiola, was it just trying to develop these because he's watching pro quarterbacks do it?
Yeah, it's a little just like Mahomes. Dylan Raiola was an elite baseball player.
Okay, all right.
He could have been a Division I baseball player. He was a catcher, and when he first came to Nebraska as a recruit, as a freshman, he was still playing high-level prospect baseball, and that was like the sport that he grew up playing. And then he evolved into a quarterback like he is now, but that was down in Texas. But he trains, interesting enough, with both of the Mahomes trainers. Bobby Strope in Kansas City, he's gone down there and worked with him a number of times. And then Jeff Christensen, the quarterback guru in Fort Worth, Texas, he's gone down there and he does, a couple, 2-3 workouts a year down there with Jeff Christensen. He actually flew Nebraska's receivers down to Fort Worth to work out with him and Jeff Christensen for that deal. And that's the world of NIL now, where you're starting quarterbacks making that kind of money that they can flip the bill for not just dinner anymore. They can do trips or whatever it takes to build the team.
Hey, Minnesota's quarterback did it. We talked to him. He's the transfer from New Hampshire, and he's like, yeah, I brought all my receivers down, and they hung out with my parents at the lake in Georgia. I was like, oh, guess we can just do that now.
Yeah, it's a different world when you hear, just the cars, the clothes. These guys have a way different college experience than obviously even 5 or 8 years ago. Let alone 20, 30 years ago.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Dylan Raiola catcher thing. I'm sure there are some eagle-eared viewers, listeners who are like, I know of a quarterback who is a catcher. That'd be Tom Brady. Very famously a catcher in high school.
Matthew Stafford.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I hadn't heard. Was there a famous pitcher who played with him?
Well, and guess who was Matthew Stafford's center in Detroit? Dominic Raiola.
There you go.
So,
it's just such a small sporting world, but it is. This is a ton of hype for a freshman, and we're not even talking about, like, is he going to start or anything like that. It just feels like it's sort of decided.
Right. Yeah. Rule has not said it, but it's very obvious to anybody that's around the program, the way he carries himself. Look, Heinrich Haarberg was last year's starter. He took over and he won all 5 of Nebraska's games for them. And that's a good backup, a guy to have in there. He's athletic enough to do other things too. If they wanted Heinrich Haarberg to be a wildcat or, take on some other roles, he has that ability to do those things too. So they've got a good situation in that quarterback room, and it's very hard to have that in the transfer portal era of college football, to have 2 or 3 quarterbacks on your roster that you feel good about right now.
So, Sean, I'm going to ask you the same question I've asked some of the folks that we've talked to from the other team sites, and probably a little bit different answers from Ohio State and Georgia and Alabama. I think you have a little more to choose from here, but of the games on Nebraska's schedule, what's the one that most of your Husker Online subscribers would say this is a gimme win, sure thing, that you're looking at and going, I'm not so sure?
And let's take out the UTEP and Northern Colorado game. That's just too easy to go with those.
Right. We're not doing that. Yeah.
I'll say Rutgers. It's a home game. It's homecoming. Nebraska has never lost to Rutgers since they've joined the Big Ten. That's the only Big Ten team they still have an undefeated record against in the 14 years now that they've been in the conference. But Rutgers with Greg Schiano, they have a great schedule. They have the leading rusher in the Big Ten returning. They will be physical. They will get after Dylan Raiola. They have the chance to try to make that an ugly game and win in Lincoln. I think that's a game of Nebraska's first 7 games, Andy. Rutgers is the only opponent Nebraska plays in the first 7 that was in a bowl game a year ago. Think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, and one thing to watch, because you'll get a good taste of Rutgers. They go to Lane Stadium, play Virginia Tech on September 21st. Virginia Tech's going to be a pretty good team. Like if Rutgers can go in there and beat Virginia Tech, that's where worry about that game, especially. But I think that's a matchup of 2 very experienced defenses, and it'll be a good test for Nebraska's offense.
Well, yeah, and look at Rutgers' overall Big Ten schedule. They don't play Michigan. They don't play Ohio State. They don't play Oregon. They don't play Penn State. And they don't play Iowa. They are the only team in the conference that does not play any of the top 5 preseason teams. So there's some tiebreakers out there where Rutgers could put themselves in the discussion because they don't play anybody. And we actually don't, as far as I know, Andy, we don't know the tiebreakers yet other than head-to-head for the Big Ten Conference or the SEC. And I believe the 2 leagues are working together to kind of develop a uniform tiebreaker system, because that will be a very big deal to win your conference now going forward.
Very much so. And if the playoff happens to expand to 14, like it's been suggested it will in a couple of years, those tiebreakers may have the effect on who gets the buys or who has a chance to get the buys in the playoff, the only buys in the playoff. So, yeah, I would expect them to work together on, but you're right. They have not told us that. The one thing that we've been told is Mark Womack from the SEC has said that it would not be college football playoff ranking related because that doesn't come out till Tuesday, and the league needs to know Sunday which teams are playing in its championship game.
Which is interesting because like there's a scenario where Rutgers could easily go 10-2, and they could be in a position where they're tied with some other teams. I mean, Iowa too. I think Iowa has a schedule that could vault.
That's the one, Sean, I'm curious about, because I think the Iowa-Nebraska game at the end of the year for Iowa, because they do get Ohio State, but they don't get any of those other teams you talked about. For Iowa, that could mean a playoff berth. It could mean a potential Big Ten championship game. We'll see. I mean, we'll see how the offense looks.
Yeah,
we don't even know who's going to play quarterback at this point.
Other than Ohio State, you tell me a game on there where Iowa's an underdog.
They're favored in all of them, except maybe Nebraska at the end of the season, depending on how Nebraska plays.
And that game in Iowa City is going to be a night game on NBC. So it should really be some appointment viewing for a lot of fans to watch that game on Black Friday on NBC at night. It's got a chance to be a really great stage. It's usually been an 11 a.m. kind of a sleepy Thanksgiving hangover.
It's been the Big Ten Network's kind of signature game the last few years. Like it would be on BTN on Black Friday in the afternoon, and that would be the big one for BTN for the entire year.
And now we get Wisconsin and Minnesota on Black Friday as well as Iowa, Nebraska. So it's a pretty good slate. They're going to have 2 Black Friday Big Ten games every year, which I think will help the viewership of the Big Ten games that weekend, because Minnesota, Wisconsin buried on the Saturday with Ohio State, Michigan. It was always kind of tough to get that in the schedule.
Well, and that's been a fun one the last couple of years. When Minnesota a few years ago finally broke that streak against Wisconsin, it it got buried by other games that are going on in that giant rivalry Saturday. So that is a really good spot to put that game in. But yeah, I'm glad that I think was it Sean Eichhorst who was going to try to move that game off of Black Friday. I'm glad that the Nebraska fans rose up and made sure that didn't happen.
I mean, that was one of the things that pushed him out the door, that decision to do that. And if not for COVID in 2020, because they were supposed to play Minnesota on Black Friday in 2020, that had been arranged. But then because of the schedule changes that happened in 2020, they were able to kind of alter it to allow Nebraska and Iowa to play Black Friday in an empty stadium in Iowa City that I was at for that game. So it's a big deal. I mean, Nebraska and Iowa, this will be the 14th year in a row they've played on Black Friday. And Nebraska has a history of playing on Black Friday and Thanksgiving that goes all the way back to Oklahoma.
Yeah. I can't wait for any of this. I just, the newness of it all and seeing these different matchups, like the idea that Nebraska plays USC in a conference game this year in the Coliseum in November is wild to me.
And I personally, I love the time of year they drew this game, because usually you're playing in Madison on that day for Nebraska.
Yeah.
Somewhere. And so what does that mean? Maybe if Dylan Raiola can actually run his full arsenal of passing plays for 4 quarters, versus we've seen games that time of year in this conference where half the game, the wind is so bad, you can't throw.
Yep. Well, and Nebraska does not have to go to the new makeshift stadium at Northwestern, which, speaking of the wind, that one, God bless any quarterback who has to play a game in that stadium. It is Lake Michigan is 25 yards away.
They're going to let kids fish during the game or something off the shore.
It's going to be awesome.
I selfishly would like to see
game is there. Wisconsin Northwestern is at that stadium.
I would love to see Nebraska play there just to see how their fans would take over this thing.
Oh my God. It would be incredible, because I think it's going to be 15,000 seats, 20,000 seats.
Yeah, it's and it's at least 2 seasons they're going to be playing in this thing, right?
Yeah. And then if Nebraska were coming, they put it at Wrigley, because they the Illinois game and the Ohio State game are at Wrigley Field this year. But yeah, here's a hypothetical for you. And we've heard Lincoln Riley give a bunch of excuses this preseason that sounds to me like managing expectations. If that doesn't go very well, what will the percentage of fans be in the Coliseum in that game? What percentage Nebraska fans will the Coliseum be?
Oh, I mean, if the last time Nebraska played there, which was Bill Callahan in 2006, there was 25,000 plus Nebraska fans.
And USC was awesome then.
And that was Pete Carroll, a young Ndamukong Suh playing for Nebraska, and Marlon Lucky. And I mean, that was one of my favorite games I've ever been to, just the amount of people that traveled. But anytime Nebraska's played in one of these new Pac-12 teams that have come in, they generally take 20 to 25,000 fans on those trips, because there are so many Husker fans that are on the West Coast, and this is their one game they would generally go to.
Well, I'm fascinated to see where because that could be, if USC's defense is better, then you could have a USC that is competing for a college football playoff berth, that is riding high, where the atmosphere for that game will be off the charts. Or if it goes badly, it could be all Nebraska fans, and that will be just as weird. Yeah,
I'm interested in their quarterback situation, because I do think the kid they brought from UNLV is a good quarterback, and it would not surprise me if he ended up at some point taking that job over there.
Well, I think that's why he came, because Mayava was very good for UNLV last year, and Miller Moss looked awesome in the bowl game. He looked in command, looked like he had the respect of his teammates, all that stuff. But that's one game, and we don't know where Louisville was at in that game. So we kind of need to see it. They're playing LSU. They'll play Michigan early, so we'll have a pretty good idea early where USC is on all this. But yeah, that is interesting, because Mayava, remember, was committed to Georgia for a minute and then flipped over to USC, even though that job didn't seem open. So that tells you maybe there's a possibility.
And I there's some coaches I know in the Mountain West, and they said Mayava was the best player in their league in terms of upside and long term. So it's no mistake that USC and Georgia were the two teams. And I think Miami kicked the tires on him as well. And I mean, he played their bowl game, though, which was kind of a surprise because it looked like he was going to leave before their bowl and played the bowl, then went in the portal.
Yeah, I am very interested to see how some of these QB situations shake out because they seem clear now, but after a couple games, they might get muddy. Meanwhile, Nebraska, do you expect Rule to name Raiola the starter, or do you expect it to just be he comes out in the UTEP game?
So I think they'll put a depth chart out, is my guess, but they'll have one more week of training camp this week. And it wouldn't surprise me after this week if they kind of define things a little bit clearer. You don't have to worry now about players transferring in August. I can remember when Scott Frost really battled, do I name Martinez the starter over Tristan Gebbia? When do I do it? Well, he did it at the absolute latest you could, the Sunday or whatever before the game against Akron. Well, Gebbia was in the portal the next day, and there was enough time for him to get to Oregon State and leave. You can't do that anymore. So that is one advantage the coaches have, because you used to have to kind of worry about, there was time for guys to go in the portal and land somewhere and preserve their eligibility, especially if a school was in the quarter system. Tristan
Gebbia, by the way, whose college career ended last year at Ohio State.
He's older than us. I mean, that guy, he literally was at Nebraska back in the Mike Riley era.
He's got to be a doctor by now. That's all I know. It's incredible. Sean Callahan, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Andy.
Rocky Top Tom in the chat. If Nebraska's other QB is still the guy who turned it over 4 times per game last year, I'm betting on Raiola to be the starter. Haha. Jeff Simmons is at Arizona State, sir. Believe he will be the backup to Sam Leavitt at Arizona State. So, yeah, I think Raiola feel pretty safe in that one. That was the great Sean Callahan. Again, if you'd like to subscribe to Husker Online or any of our other great team sites, use the code Andy1 at checkout for $1 off. Sorry, $1 for your first month. $1 off your first month. Maybe not the greatest deal in the world. $1 for your first month is a hell of a deal. So use that code Andy1 at checkout to sign up for On3. $1 for your first month. All right. Here's the plan. Tomorrow, Wednesday, quarterback fantasy draft, me against Jesse Simonton. We did this exercise last year. I got lucky, got Jaden Daniels in round 5, got Dylan Gabriel in round 9 as we take 10 quarterbacks. And I wound up wiping the floor with Jesse. What's going to happen this year? We shall see. But it is our fantasy quarterback draft, and no obvious number 1 pick in this one. It's going to be tricky. Also, Thursday, Dear Andy. So we'll have the Dear Andy column for those of you trying to goof off at work but can't make a sound. And then we'll have, of course, the Dear Andy show for those of you who are goofing off at work and have headphones. We need your questions, though. We love when you drive the show. So, Andy_Staples on Twitter, Andy_Staples on Instagram, Andy Staples on 3 at gmail.com for your epic questions that are too long for social media, or maybe you want to send a video question. We do love those. So send those questions in. Thursday is your Dear Andy show. Tomorrow, QB Fantasy Draft. We'll talk to you tomorrow.